Under Armour's warning that the coronavirus outbreak could cause up to $60 million lost sales this quarter, and it gets worse later in the year. Shares of Under Armour are down sharply, down 17% as a result of that. But to be fair, Under Armour does have a variety of other problems which are giving it cause for concern as well, besides just that. John Denton is the global head of the International Chamber of Commerce. He joins me now from London. What are your members telling you? What do they actually want? Obviously, they're concerned, but what do they want and need?
In the context of the virus, I think that the description that Jay Powell gave is actually pretty accurate. I mean, the real worry we have is if this is going to be persistent. We know it's pernicious, but will it be persistent? And it's just too early to tell yet as to whether that's the way to play out. Again, a bit like one of your other guests, I'm not an expert in the virus itself, but what I do know, and from the members and from the businesses in China that participate in the ICC, and we have millions there is genuine concern. I mean, there's been a lot of nervousness about the way in which the virus was first handled when it was best understood for what was going on in China. But I think what people are taking a little bit of heart from is the way in which the Chinese authorities have actually acted quite decisively, in many respects, surprisingly decisively, in a way that a number of countries could not do so, to close this down. But of course, we've got people there whose...
Is it
I was going to say,
possible?
we've got people there whose families have lost loved ones. We've got people there whose families are actually still in suffering. So obviously, I think with the rest of the global community, we reach out and we give our empathy and our sympathy and support to the Chinese business community and to the citizens there.
Is it possible that your members have had to change supply lines at very short notice? And managed to put in place, because your global members will have been having problems sourcing matters from China?
Well, look, I mean, the reality is that most of the effect at the moment is being felt within China. We're also seeing, particularly around China, particularly in Asia-Pac. I mean, I'm an Australian. You're seeing some of the effects in Australia. So you're actually seeing some deliberate change to the way in which supply chains are operating. And in a funny way, some extraordinary innovations that are coming into it. But if this is persistent, and that is the problem, then we're actually going to see some significant shifts in the way in which those companies operate. And actually, a lot of that may well be quite detrimental, I think, to the growth outlook for China. And this is the problem. But also to the growth outlook for countries peripheral to China, particularly in Asia-Pac, and actually in countries like Australia. And then more broadly, where you've got the interrelationships. The big difference between this and, say, SARS is just the size of the engagement of China in the global economy in 2020 compared to where it was in 2003.
But what do you mean by there could be some longer-lasting shifts? Are you suggesting if people have managed to circumvent China, they may stay circumvented?
Well, look, think about, for example, overseas students in, say, Australia. At the moment, there's a fundamental disruption to the way in which the overseas student market is operating in Australia. That's coming about because students cannot travel to Australia. Students are being forced to stay back in China. What you'll find is that workaround, if it actually is persistent, may ultimately have an impact in the way in which that sector of the economy in Australia will operate.
Can I ask you about trade tensions and the alleviation of those with the Phase 1 agreement between the United States and China? There's been much rah-rah about that. Phase 2 comes along. But your members have been concerned for many months on worsening trade relations, not only with China, but elsewhere in the world. Are they seeing things getting easier?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to understand about the US-China trade issues is that we're talking about Phase 1 and Phase 2. It's actually a game in two halves. The first half, no doubt, has actually, clearly from my perspective, been a clear win for the US. Frankly, the situation for China is actually not so bad when you actually look at it in its totality. Where the losers are is with the WTO and actually small countries or small powers that actually rely upon the multilateral trading system. Phase 2 is going to be a different game, and clearly the outcome of Phase 2 is going to be kick down the path beyond the US elections in November. And so, and the reason that's happening is it's just much harder Phase one was around trade and investment. Trade two is going to be around structural reforms to the Chinese economy, and that's going to be much harder to deliver. Now, the good thing about phase one is it's actually taken a lot of the tension and a lot of the volatility out of the global markets, and are actually seeing some confidence come back in there. So in many respects, phase one, the first half, is actually a net win. But phase two is going to be a problem, and underlying that, the losers is the WTO and the challenges we now see and clear risk we see for small powers. If two major powers can operate outside the multilateral trading system, what does that mean for the reliance on the multilateral trading system, which is so critical to the way in which trade disputes are understood and managed for small and medium powers? We want them back in, and it's a warning signal to the WTO that it must reform itself.
Good to see you, John Denton. Thank you for joining us from London tonight.